So I just finished reading Erich Fromm's The Fear of Freedom. Some other places call it like The Fear from Freedom or Fear and Freedom. The book title changes depending on the country you're in, but the one I have is called The Fear of Freedom. They're all the same book. Now, I don't want to review every part of this book because one, I don't think it's necessary, but two, I don't want to make the video too long. So I'm going to focus on three chapters or major parts of the book that I think are different enough to discuss because the book does repeat itself quite a bit. So Fromm has this idea in this chapter called the psychological problem of freedom. And he starts off by communicating the idea through history. He says that men have strived for freedom, whether it's religious freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, or even individual freedoms, that over time they have gone further and further and further, shed more blood to get these kinds of freedoms, like, for example, for democracy or for capitalism. And he said that there's a psychological problem here. And the problem is that as men gain more freedom, they want to give up more freedom. And you'll see why this is in another chapter. But basically, the idea here is people who go into democracy enslave themselves into democracy. They might say that they're more free, but that they actually become enslaved to democracy. The same thing holds true for capitalism. Maybe we escape feudalism, and as a result, we gain the freedom of free time. But as a result, we enslave ourselves towards money or towards wage work. So this wage slave is the new term. Things like this, right? It's a psychological problem that he calls the psychological problem of freedom. Now, slightly related to the psychological problem of freedom is this chapter called the ambiguity of freedom and the emergence of the individual, which is really, it can be reframed into two core ideas. The one idea is that on a historical level, or a societal level, there are systems, and those systems can favor individualism or collectivism, depending, right? It's a dynamic thing that changes over time. He argues that within modern history, so from feudalism to modern day, we've moved more towards individualism. And the other idea is that there's an individualism that occurs within your own life. So let's say going from a child to an adult, you're going to go from more of a collective, like, bundle of experiences towards being a more defined self or a more aware individual. And these two things can interplay to shape our societies. Fromm would probably say that feudalism was a collective awareness, or that we're more in touch with nature, and that as time has gone on, we're more aware of ourselves. He says the same thing about children, that they're more in touch with the world around them. And as time goes on, we have more awareness of ourselves. And he says that to some extent, we kind of want this bundle of experiences, this collectiveness, but we also want some kind of individualism, and that there is a healthy relationship that you can develop as an adult. But a lot of people can develop unhealthy relationships where they want just that collective experiences and the absolution of the individual, which is dysfunctional. And there are reasons why people want the absolution of the individual, which is because it's terrifying, it's difficult, it's not easy to be yourself or a unique person. That's a very difficult thing to do. And the freedom as an ambiguous concept thing has to do with the way that he defines freedom. So he says something to the effect that freedom is the awareness which man has of being free from some other thing. So as long as someone perceives himself as being free from feudalism, then being in capitalism is freedom. Now, of course, he says it's an ambiguous thing because in capitalism, arguably, you could be less free. Some people would argue this, that you have to work for money, that you have to get a job, you have to follow the higher education route, so on and so forth. Being free from, let's say, autocracy means that you're enslaved to democracy. This is what Fromm kind of has this worldview where things are trade-offs. And so he says that there's this ambiguity of freedom because of that. Now, the last piece of information, or like last chapter worth mentioning, although I've sampled from quite a few chapters here, is this thing called the two aspects of freedom. And it has to do with internal constraints and external constraints, which can be linked to these kinds of social systems I've been talking about. So I've said that some social systems are emergent, or some social systems are more collective in their awareness. Some of them are more individualistic, right? Well, the same goes for these internal and external constraints. Some of them have external constraints, some of them have internal constraints. And the example he gives actually is that Religion is an external constraint. It places constraints on your behaviors, and so you have an external constraint on your freedom. Capitalism, when you gain it, although removes some of these external constraints, gives you internal constraints. And these internal constraints can be things like, for example, placing limits on your value system. So if you live within capitalism, right, and you don't want to be a radical individual, which Fromm says most people don't, then you have to adopt the values of capitalism, which is namely something like materialism, right, or the preference for money. These things become ends in themselves as opposed to means to an end. And there's some internal constraints on your value systems, right? So you have the freedom from religion, but you don't have the freedom to choose any value system you want. And he actually argues that Christianity set the foundation or the groundwork for capitalism, because he gives examples within Christianity that's like, you should be doing service for like the church, not for the church's sake, but for the sake of your own sake of being perceived in the eyes of the Lord, things like this. And he says that those are internal constraints that were conditioned into man and then made it more favorable for capitalism to be adopted afterwards, because man was already so used to all these internal constraints. Interesting ideas, but I don't know. Overall, the book is I'm going to say a 6.5 out of 10. He interestingly adopts a lot of Marxian lenses throughout the book. Like he talks about the alienation of man caused by the modern forms of work and how that impacts not just the individual psychology, but the also societal level. That's kind of interesting. He does have a lot of fun ideas inside the book, but they aren't fundamentally different from other things I've read. So I was actually kind of surprised by how similar he was to Becker in a lot of things, Ernest Becker. Not exactly the same, but there are a lot of similarities in the analysis that they have, like the framework of analysis they use to analyze society. Their frameworks are very similar. They might have some differences in the fundamental beliefs, but the mechanics and the overall framework are very similar. He also has similarities to Rolomé. He is quite similar to a lot of different authors, and as a result, it comes off as a bit repetitive. But some of the ideas are fun. I would say also the book is wrong in its title. It's not the fear of freedom. I think fear from freedom. Yeah, that's also probably not true. That's probably also not a good title. It's probably like why men gave up freedom is probably a better subtitle for the book. But to keep that in mind if you're going to consider reading it. I would say it's worth a read if you're interested in freedom literature. It's not a bad start. That's why I read it. I'm writing something about freedom and I read this. I know it's a popular book on Bookstagram. I think it's a bit too popular. It's not worth all the hype. Yeah, I would say 6.5 out of 10. But those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. And with that being said, bye-bye.